Mr. Paul Wallace, it is awesome to see you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend it with us here at Leak Project. How the heck are you?
I'm pretty good. A touch of hay fever today. Other than that, I'm tip top. And Rex, thanks for having me on again. I always enjoy our conversations.
Oh man, me too. Thank you. It's an honor. And as I was telling you off air, a great friend of mine sent me a link to one of your videos that you've done recently on the Anunnaki, and I think it's got 800,000 plus views. So really happy to see that. Really happy to see the coverage that you're getting and the descriptions you're putting together. So I want to talk about this extraterrestrial intervention, and it seems as if the scriptures from around the world describe these sky travelers. There is growing concern that there will be a global social credit system linked to your search habits. You want to keep your information safe, secure, and anonymous when you surf the web. Go to virtualshield.com/leakproject. You can get a massive discount for a limited time as a Leak Project listener, and this is one of the best VPNs on the planet. It's fast, it's efficient, you can even surf from different locations around the world. Get the discount, click the links, you'll be glad you did, and keep being the change you want to see, everybody. Enjoy this presentation. But then when you start to connect it to the zodiac, at least lately, when I've been reading these ancient mythological texts like the cuneiform tablets, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's certain passages that seem to be much more connected with the zodiac will and the constellations than extraterrestrials. So I wonder if, because they've been rewriting stuff for so long and these translations could be far off. And a lot of times in these cuneiform tablets, when it gets to the real juicy stuff, it seems like, they're like, oh, that part we couldn't translate, so they're keeping stuff from us, I wonder. But I'm kind of split, I'm like, are they describing, are the gods and the goddesses that we have talked about as being extraterrestrial? Is it the stars, is it the planets, is it the constellations, or is it actually space travelers, very highly advanced beings, and they're messing with us?
I think in a number of our ancient texts, you've got layers of story going on. So whether you're looking at the cuneiform texts or the Mesoamerican narratives or the Bible, what we have is collections of writings about the beginnings that have all been mushed together. And the thread that I've been following in particular is the ET aspect of that, the memories of contact with other species who came and modified our ancestors and governed over our ancestors. But that's not the only layer in the story. So when you go to the Andes, for instance, and you listen to their stories, you begin to pick up that some of these stories are metaphors for things that happened in our solar system in a deep and distant past. There were alterations in the configuration of our solar system that were so dramatic that they impacted life on Earth. And so you've got stories that reflect that, stories that reflect a time when the planet Saturn appeared to be influencing life and death on Earth more directly than the sun was. And you can only boggle your mind to picture the solar system in which that is happening. Nevertheless, that layer appears to be there. So you've got that layer. You've got the layer of ET visitations. I believe that these visitations happened over aeons. So you may have two stories of two visitations in different eras, all mushed into the story of beginnings. And then on top of that, you've got the more recent edits of those works. So for instance, in the Bible, as recently as the 6th century BCE, you had editors rework those stories into something that would make sense in order to teach monotheism and endorse the monarchy and the priesthood. So you've now got 3 or 4 layers all happening within the same story. And so I think sometimes these mysteries remain not because of anyone holding back on their translation work, but because it can get a little bit confusing as to which story we're reading right now.
The Epic of Gilgamesh, a prime example, wonderful story. And there's different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but he wants to reach immortality.
Yes.
And so the scripture that I was the part of the scripture that I was talking about is where essentially, let me read this to you real quick from the mythology of Aquarius. The mother goddess, infuriated that a mortal would interfere with the natural order of things, sends a bull, which is Taurus, and a pride of lions, which is Leo, to prevent Gilgamesh from reaching his goal. However, Gilgamesh perseveres. His harshest test comes at the gates to the underworld, where he outwits and defeats the scorpion warriors who guard the entrance, which could be then you've got Scorpio. So you've got Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, which make up the first three signs of the Grand Cross. And then these represented the qualities that would have mastered to be mastered before Gilgamesh could enter the underworld, where the immortal Utnapishtim lives. Utnapishtim is recognized as Aquarius. So, and Aquarius is the age of man. It's the age of God, man, and reaching this, like reaching our higher selves. So that's a part of astrotheology. But then you find out about, how do I put this? Like there was a information request for the Tome of Gilgamesh, right? So my question is Gilgamesh real, or is Gilgamesh mythology and like a story of the stars?
Oh, Gilgamesh is such an interesting and a linchpin figure. That first question, is he real? Let's go there first of all. We had the opportunity to settle that once and for all in public in 2003, when with 99% probability, we discovered his remains. We discovered his tomb. Now, up until that point, it was a moot question. Is this a memory of a real king from time past, or is it simply the earliest story known to humankind, which it is? Well, back in 2003, we, the Allies, went into Iraq, and within days of getting into the country, there was a team excavating the probable site of Gilgamesh's tomb, which had been located through new technology by Jörg Fassbinder, who had taken a university team in to locate it. So it was all very exciting. It was all over the news. Gilgamesh's tomb found, and then it all went silent. And I didn't find out. It was a couple of years later that Jörg Fassbinder resurfaces on the TV somewhere. Oh no, he's talking to a French magazine saying, "Oh, we decided not to proceed any further and have reburied the site and hidden it just so it won't get damaged." Well, really? Do you believe that?
No.
The priority that was placed on getting there, the protection of the US Army to ensure we got those artifacts, really, we just stopped halfway through and said, "Oh no, let's not bother. Let's just cover it all up." It seems more likely that they didn't want to test it in public and get an answer that says, "Oh, wow, he's not entirely human." Because the moment you get a result like that, it authenticates the story of Gilgamesh, which is the story of a hybrid entity who was the governor of a particular region of what is now Iraq in the distant past. If you suddenly, in public, reveal a result like that, then it authenticates a different story of human origins. And I think they just didn't want to let that cat out of the bag. So you've got the actual historic person who was the crossover king between the Anunnaki, the ETs who governed over our ancestors, and then the human rulers who came after them. Gilgamesh was the pivot point in that story, the crossover. And many ancient narratives have those figures, whether you go to the story of the Oba and the Ojisu from out of Nigeria. It begins with us being governed by star beings and then governed by human beings. You go to the Bible, we're governed by Yahweh, and then we're governed by Saul, the first human king. The pattern repeats. It's there in the Egyptian narratives as well. So there's that aspect to the story. That's the story of Gilgamesh. But the Gilgamesh epic has lots of other layers in it as well. And there are stories about the origins of humanity itself buried in that epic. One aspect of it is of this pursuit of immortality that you mentioned. Well, what does that really mean? I mean, just start at the basic question, does anyone really want to be immortal? I've yet to meet anyone who would really want that, because after the first couple of millennia, it's hard not to get bored. That's just the common sense question. Who would want to be immortal? dig a little deeper in the story and you realize it's not about length of life. It's about intelligence, consciousness, and whether you are an advanced being. If you are governed over by beings who are more advanced than yourself, wouldn't you want to be one of them? And that's the story that's buried in Genesis 3, where the ET governors are debating over how intelligent the humans should be. Should they be like us, or do we just keep them like as a slave species? And there's a disagreement among the Elohim in the Bible or the Anunnaki in the Sumerian telling of the story as to which way it's going to go. There's a great long story in the Popol Vuh, the Mesoamerican story, tackling exactly the same thing. Go to the story of a Bassi and a Thai from out of Africa. It's the same discussion. How intelligent, how advanced do we want the humans to be? Go to the story of Zeus and Prometheus from out of Greece. It's the same struggle. Prometheus says, oh, let's make them a bit cleverer. Let's give them some technology. And Zeus says, enough of that. I'm going to put a stop to that. That's what it's really about. It's not about extending our life, finding an elixir that's the fountain of youth. It's about human beings wanting to be like the beings who govern them. And that's the real meaning of that story that's buried in narratives all around the world, including our most ancient narrative, the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah, no, that's cool. No, let's talk about Zeus for a minute, because Zeus is connected to Jupiter, right? And if you look at the major gods, they're always associated or oftentimes associated with either the planets or the stars or the constellations or all of the above. So when you go that level, then how do you differentiate between the two? Between a god as a planet and a god as an anthropomorphic being that can create and destroy and have, you know, essentially these powers of magnificent abilities for us to call them the gods?
That's a really good question. I can't really answer that definitively. What I would say is that the dramas of the characters are fairly easily understood, and the dramas of the characters do repeat in cultures all around the world. Then we realize there's this correlation to planetary history, and that's somewhere I've yet to go to really research. But it seems to me that the planetary aspect is the earlier layer of the story. And that's something you probably need to go and read Zecharia Sitchin to get insight onto how those two layers go together. But what I'm finding is that planet Earth has had a number of resets of civilization, and that we do have fragments of stories of endings and beginnings from a number of resets, and that the planetary stories come from an earlier reset than most of our so-called creation narratives, which I think are only about 10,000 years old. So ask me in a year's time, Rex, and I've done a bit more research on that planetary aspect, and in particular, how it's told in the Andes in Central and South America, because that's part of the story that was very deliberately suppressed when that continent was taken over by Portugal and Spain back in the day. And I'm wanting to be part of the uncovering process of all that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Totally appreciate that. And I wasn't trying to throw any curveballs out at you. I'm just so fascinated with how these older stories seem to be able to incorporate the political aspect of the time. They combine the stars and the planet, like the astrotheology aspect to it. And then they can also tell personal stories of evolution and ascension, like the hero's journey. It's fascinating. And so I'm just like, there's a missing link there. Where's that
Yes.
missing link? And I think that's what you're doing such an amazing job with what you do. And I also wanted to, so let's get into this, man. Like the series of you've been doing this wonderful series of Yahweh and Jesus. And I think it's fascinating. I want to talk about that. So Yahweh, who's Yahweh?
Well, Yahweh is a name everyone needs to know about if they're going to read the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and try and make sense of what is this really about. It is the holy name of God in the Hebrew canon. It's the name that was revealed to Moses as the story goes. except anyone reading the Bible will spot that the name has turned up long before Moses is born. And so to anyone reading with that attention, it's the first clue that those earlier stories have been retold after the time of Moses. So after this name Yahweh has appeared, and it's the name for God, it has been pasted over the stories that came before Moses. So that's kind of the first red flag that says there was an earlier version of those earlier stories. What were they about? And it turns out they were about the Elohim, the powerful ones. So Yahweh is the first clue that you've got older stories in an older form that you can begin to reconstruct simply by reading them with the word Elohim in them, which means powerful ones. Read them that way, and they flip around and start telling a different story. In the 6th century BCE, the whole of the Hebrew canon, all the different texts that had been gathered together, the different scrolls that had been glued together, were reworked, and the name Yahweh was pasted over the whole story to make it appear like a seamless story of God from beginning to end. And the name of God is Yahweh, the holy name we use. So that's the story, that's the message. The problem with that is that among these ancient scrolls and texts are stories of totally different kinds of entities. And among the powerful ones, you've got stories of some who came, visited our ancestors, and nurtured human society. And then you've got stories of others who came, not interested in human beings. They're here just for the minerals, thank you very much. And they'll kill anyone who gets in their way because they just want that stuff. You've got others who are governing here, others governing here, and then they are competing for territory and minerals, and they're sending their humans out to war against each other, and thousands are getting slaughtered in the process. There are entities, I believe, in the Hebrew stories that are reptilian entities, what we would call dragons. Cultures all around the world remember these entities that governed over our ancestors that were horrible, scary, massive, reptilian-like creatures, and those become Yahweh stories. So a lot of distortion comes in when you start telling dragon stories as if they're God stories and the name of God is Yahweh, or the stories of E.T. Colonizers, and you tell that as a Yahweh story. And then you go and tell the story of a cosmic source, and that becomes a Yahweh story. It all gets muddled together. And so one of the things I do in my books, Escaping from Eden and the Scars of Eden, is say, okay, let's understand that name has been pasted over the stories. What happens if we read them as Elohim stories and translate the root meanings of the words? So Elohim now means powerful ones. Ruach now means something moving through the air, creating a strong breeze. Tub now means equipment. Kavod now means craft. These are the root meanings of the words. And as soon as you make these switches by going to the root meanings, the plurality of these beings, or here's another word, ekie, life form, interacting with the human beings. The moment you do the translation work, suddenly not only do you have technology in the Bible, but you've got a whole range of entities visiting us from off planet, interfering in our history. And you lose all that when you paste the name God over the stories and say they're all God stories, or Yahweh and say they're all Yahweh stories. My books say, no, they're not. They're telling a far more interesting story of human origins than that. Let's take a look at it and then decide what we make of it.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that information. So it sounds like Yahweh in certain situations it's like a title. It's referencing, or maybe an adverb. Would it be an adverb?
Well, in the story, Moses is encountered by this entity who comes and governs over his people group. And Moses says, who shall I say sent me? What's your name? And that's where this name Yahweh is given. Now, if you go deep into Hebrew interlinears and lexicons and commentaries, well, they have a go at trying to work out what that name really means. And you will realized pretty quickly that what's happened is we've been given a name, and in all the time since, we've been trying to work out, what does that mean? I don't know that word. And so translations have been attempted. It's that way round. My theory is that it really was the entity's name in a foreign language that Moses did not understand, and he reported exactly what he heard. But because it wasn't given in a human language, we're left a bit mystified as to what it really means. So traditionally, it's understood as I am, or I will be what I will be, which is sort of a non-answer to his question. And that could be accurate. But no, I think it's an actual name of an actual entity, one of the many Elohim who came and governed over humanity in the deep past.
Wow. Wow. Now let's take this to the Watchers, and let's take this to the Book of Enoch, which is a fascinating read. And it's, once again, you've got a lot of astrotheology, I think, mixed in there. And then, because if the giants are as big as they're described, they're, the born of the Nephilim, like they're almost a mile in height, man. That's a pretty big giant dude. Fascinating read. And I think some of the stuff in there it might be spot on, but then there's all this code, in my opinion. I mean, there could have been giants that were a mile tall, maybe. What are your thoughts?
Yes. Yes, I think the height of the giants is a really fascinating question. Where I approach it is through the texts that I've studied, which are ancestral narratives, beginning with the Hebrew stories into the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, Syrian, and then around the world, and finding parallels in Africa, Mesoamerica, Europe, India, in the Celtic countries, the Norse countries. And the stories of hybridization there speak of giants that are not a mile high, but are considerably larger than your average human being, on a scale that I think reflects fairly accurately when you look at the art of ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia, where you've got beings, this tall, and they're being served by beings this tall. So those stories I'm familiar with. There are evidences, textual and paleontological, that do suggest enormous beings. And I do have some stories that I might go into in the next Eden book that might raise an eyebrow or two and get people thinking a little bit outside the square in terms of how big a creature could be that would operate on planet Earth. But going back to this scale, that story really is very prevalent, and you can't avoid that the moment you start listening to ancestral narratives with an open ear. There are beings who came and hybridized, without a doubt. People who read the Bible come across this in Genesis chapter 6, and the story is told as if the writer expects the readers to already know this. He seems to think we're familiar with the story of hybridization, and I think it's because he assumes we've all read the book of Enoch. Interestingly, in the New Testament as well, if you go to the book of Jude, the writer of Jude assumes we've all read the book of Enoch, and he refers to it very, very quickly and then quotes from it word from word by word. The story of hybridization that's being referenced there echoes in the Greek story of the Titans. So just to spell that out, what's happening here is that another wave of visitors has arrived. In the Hebrew text, they're called the Bene Elohim, the ones like the powerful ones. The book of Enoch tells us who they were. They were watchers. Their job was to observe planet Earth, not to come and interfere. And they've broken some kind of prime directive by leaving space and coming down and interbreeding with human beings. In Genesis, it says they look down and they realize that Earth girls are hot, to translate it fairly precisely. And so they come down and they say, we want some of this in our gene pool. The children that result from this hybridization start off the same size as you and me, Rex, but then they never stop growing and they become giants. Now, there's an analogy to this. If you've ever been to a zoo and seen a liger or a tigon, you will have seen exactly the same pattern where you've got two normal-sized cats, a lion and a tiger, who come together, hybridized. They've had a kid, and the kid starts off normal and then gets much, much bigger than the parents. And the reason is that the growth inhibitor in lions, I think, is carried by the female lion, and in tigers by the male tiger. So if you have a male lion and a female tiger, oops, there's no growth inhibitor. And the kid will just keep growing and growing. You've got a giant cat. That's the story of hybridization in Genesis 6 that results in the Nephilim in the Hebrew language, or the Titans, or the Anakim, or some of the other giant people, the Rephaim. Interestingly, that name, Anak or Anakim, repeats in cultures all around the world. They're always giants. It's there in the Hebrew, it's there in the Islamic tradition as well. So that moment is pretty well remembered and pretty well attested to. When we're looking at entities far, far larger than that, again, I think we're going further back into what we would call prehistory, which is only a way of saying the history we don't know about. And then we're looking at a whole lineage of human-like beings who may not have originated on the planet at all.
Yeah, so I can definitely see there being giants, even maybe 20 feet tall, maybe even a little bit bigger than that, but 5,000 feet tall. So why do they add code to certain parts of these texts is what I wonder. Like, do they add it because it's somebody that's initiated is going to get that extra information and they're going to know what it's referencing? There's got to be something significant about it.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean?
The reason that codes are there, some of which we can decipher and some of which we can't, is that what we're talking about has always been part of a forbidden layer of story. So a classic example would be what happened when Portugal and Spain went into Central and South America. They deleted and replaced the narratives that were there, replaced them with Christian Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, burned the books that had the earlier stories, destroyed the sites that had hard copy of those stories, and executed the priesthoods. And so that information is absolutely banned. Now, they would save a copy or two and an item or two to send to the King of Portugal and Spain and to the Pope. So there's an archiving of that information. So the information is not lost. It's just not available to the public anymore. So that's locked away there. And I mentioned this example because we know how that ancient narrative was pushed underground and was protected by the survivors of that genocide. And so 200 years later, after these invasions, the successors of those ancient priesthoods come to Francisco Jimenez with this ancient text in the language of Quiche, and they say, would you be interested in our story of beginnings? And so he translates it painstakingly over about 7 years into the Spanish of the day, and this other story emerges. So this happens every time empire goes in, whether it's the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish. They go in, they say, this is the story, we're the news agency, we tell you what's what, we will define what's taught in schools, and we will tell you what your history is. And it's full spectrum dominance. And forget the old stories, forget your old authorities, forget the indigenous wise people. They're just witch doctors. And you should be ashamed of them because they're idolaters and they'll go to hell. This is no exaggeration of what all these empires did to get rid of the earlier stories. But the earlier stories survive. Now, when this has been done in the past, how do we keep these stories alive? Well, one, you literally bury them. So the Nag Hammadi was buried full of these Gnostic texts so that they wouldn't be destroyed. They're now not part of the Christian Orthodoxy of the Roman Empire, so they've been buried so that a future generation can dig them up and read the stories. But another thing you can do is encode the stories so that you've got stories that are surviving a little bit more publicly, and the initiated will know there's a story hidden in the text or in the rhythm of the speech or in the numerical values of the words. And so this is a way that a text can survive in public with a narrative hidden in plain sight. And so that's why you get books on the Bible code, or books like mine, Escaping from Eden, saying, there's another story here, guys. There's a reveal here. You can brush over this and another story emerges. And we do it through translation. So it's all part of that bigger picture, that there's a forbidden story with information not only about our origins, but about who we are, what our potential is, what our abilities are, that has been suppressed and that will be protected through encoding the stories in paintings or in storytelling.
Right on. And dude, you've had some epic interviews recently with some amazing people. So yeah, folks, you're going to love this channel. If you haven't subscribed already, go get The Scars of Eden. Has humanity confused the idea of God with memories of ET contact? And also pick up Escaping from Eden. Does Genesis teach that the human race was created by God or engineered by ETs? If you haven't already, subscribe to Paul Wallace on YouTube and make sure you click the bell. I click the bell again so I get all notifications. And you also want to subscribe to The Fifth Kind and check out fifthkind.tv. Hope you're enjoying the podcast thus far. I want to let you know real quick that we do live shows every single day on our website, leakproject.com. They're always free, unedited, uncensored. You can ask the guest and myself questions. And if you miss the live feed, you can always sign up as a premium member and you'll get access to over 4,000 podcasts, hundreds of exclusive shows, and there's a ton of content that we only talk about on the website. So check us out, leakproject.com. And if for whatever reason you can't afford a membership, but you want to be a premium member, just send me an email. I'll take care of you. leakproject@gmail.com, because it's about being the change you want to see.